Welcome to Holding the Line, a podcast about cops, courts, and crime. I'm Jason Johnson, LELDF president and co-host of this podcast, along with Sean Kennedy, our director of policy for LELDF. Sean, great interview with Patrick Kenneally. It's a wide-ranging interview. Anyone who's interested in what it's like to be a prosecutor in America in a standard suburban community outside of a metropolitan area or in a metropolitan area, Patrick covers everything.
It's amazing how his career trajectory went. He went from wanting to be a public defender to being the elected prosecutor in one of the largest counties in Illinois. And he went from being a pothead to being an anti-pot crusader. And he's been a leader on tough on crime in Illinois, fighting back against some of the more radical policies across the state. So what Patrick says in this interview is really illuminating for anyone who wants to get into the criminal justice system, and just observing what he's learned over his career is something I think everyone should listen to.
Yep, he has a sort of a dynamic personality and a way to has a way of explaining things that's for really super accessible. So good interview, and here it is.
Patrick is honestly one of the most influential and important people in Illinois politics in the tough on crime place, and we're going to talk about why that is. Patrick was elected in 2016 to be the McHenry County state's attorney. They call him that in Illinois. They're DAs elsewhere and Commonwealth's attorneys here in Virginia and so forth. But he's basically the chief prosecutor for McHenry County. And McHenry County is adjacent, nearby of Chicago. It is one of the fastest growing jurisdictions, at least in the Midwest. And because of that, it has both a lot of wealth and a lot of challenges. And Patrick has led the law enforcement community there as chief prosecutor until his retirement last year, at the beginning of last year, and is now back in private practice. But he now can speak totally freely if he never did before. Because if you know Patrick, Patrick was one to always be very understated and keep his
Subtle.
tongue firmly in his cheek. So, Patrick, with that, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
So, Patrick, you have a very long career as a prosecutor and lawyer. Why don't you walk us through how we got to where we were up till now? You entering private practice last year. What was your career trajectory before we get into some of the substance of what you did as a prosecutor?
I was a good Chicago machine Democrat, just like my old man. And I moved out to McHenry County for the job of the prosecutor. And I originally wanted to be a Cook County public defender. I'd gone to Wash U and I had been sort of infiltrated with all of the pieties that come along with, a healthy skepticism of the criminal justice system and why it's sort of indelibly and inherently wrong and corrupt. And, thank God I live in Illinois because it ultimately saved me and put me on the path that I'm on today. But I had the job with the Cook County Public Defender's Office. And of course, Illinois, they couldn't agree on a budget. So all of the state hiring got frozen. And so they called me. They're like, all right, Kenneally, it could be 2 weeks. It could be 6 weeks. Could be a year. We just don't know when we're going to be able to hire you, but you're number two on the list. And so I was like, well, that's not great. I'm living in, my parents' basement and I want to get out. And so I just started sending out applications. Now, I'd never heard of McHenry County, but if you know anything about Chicago, there's 5 collar counties which surround Cook County, which is Chicago. And it's all sort of part and parcel of the Chicagoland area. McHenry County is on the northwest side of Cook County. So I sent a resume up there, and my dad was a lawyer, and they wanted to interview me. And I'm like, well, where the hell's McHenry County? And whatever. Once we figured out how to get there, I went for the interview just to sort of practice, and then they offered me the job. And my dad said, he's like, look, Pat, if you want to be a trial lawyer, which is what I think you want to be, there's no better job to get than being a state's attorney. And I think there's a lot of people that become state's attorneys, not because they want to enforce the laws, but just because they want to be trial attorneys and they know that state's attorney's offices afford young lawyers the opportunity to get up on your feet in front of a judge, have some actual responsibility as opposed to being an associate and holding the binder for a partner for the first 15 years of your legal career. And so ultimately, with the Cook County Public Defender's Office on ice, I just said, like, okay, I'll go do it. If something happens with the Cook County Public Defender's Office, I'll just go back and then I'll flip that into a big sort of corporate job or whatever I want to do back into the city after I get a little bit of experience and everybody recognize me for just sort of the incandescently brilliant trial attorney that I'm going to demonstrate that I am. And I just loved the job. Like I just loved it. I liked McHenry County. My wife now, who was my fiance at the time, came out to live with me in McHenry County, and I started in traffic and just started working my way up. And one of the nice things about McHenry County is it's the fifth largest county, but there was just there was a number of opportunities just to advance in the office from a very fast standpoint. So I did my first murder trial within 4 years of being a state's attorney, whereas somebody that would be part of sort of the same class in Cook County, it'd probably take you 10 to 12 years to get to the point where you're sitting on a murder
Let
trial.
me explain to our listeners here why that is more impressive. In another way is there are a lot of murders in Cook County. In a
Yeah.
given year, a few years ago, there were 1,000 across the
Yep.
county and 800 of them in Chicago. So that's a lot of murder trials, assuming, you're prosecuting murder. But in McHenry County, you guys are what, averaging 20 maybe a year
Maybe.
a few years ago? So they don't have a lot of need for murder prosecution. So that's what I mean by it.
Right. So anyway, started in traffic court, worked my way up to domestic violence. From there, worked my way up to felony review, which for all your listeners means that you take phone calls from police and you go to crime scenes and work with law enforcement on investigating cases and prepping them and getting them ready for prosecution, and you approve the charges once you have sufficient evidence in order to do so. Then I went to felony, and I think I just sort of made my bones as a lawyer that would try anything, and I did. And then ultimately, between, oh, I don't know, probably 2008 and 2016, was part of every major prosecution in McHenry County, did every single murder trial that was done there. And then in 2016, they sort of called me into the office, and Lou Bianchi, great state's attorney, he's the one who hired me. And he, so I'm sort of thinking to myself, like, oh no, you're taking the long, lonely walk down to the office of the brass, thinking to yourself, who complained? What did I do wrong? Did I blow a speedy? Like, what case? Is there a defense attorney that's going to beef me to the air? Whatever. And anyway, they're like, no, Pat, we want you to run for state's attorney. And I was like, run for state's attorney? I sort of said, like, if I run for state's attorney, I'll have to turn into one of these professional Irishmen that I've seen in Chicago, where I basically tattoo a shamrock to my head and learn to talk with an Irish brogue and wear that little paperboy hat everywhere I go. And they were like, no, 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 you're not going to have to do that. And so anyway, I ran and I was elected at 37, office of about 80, around 80 souls. And that was it. And that's kind of how I got from starting my career to being elected the state's attorney.
And when you joined the office, how big was McHenry County?
300,000. Now it's probably 350. Like I said, it's the fifth largest in Illinois.
So I mean, it's a big city. If you think about that, just to give people a scale, St. Louis City, which we obviously associate with being a big city in America, has less than 300,000 people. New Orleans has roughly 300,000 people. So McHenry County is very large, maybe not as violent as New Orleans or St. Louis, but in terms of population, that gives you a sense of scale that's a pretty big office. You sound like you were mugged by reality on the job, as they say, Irvin Crystal would say. So what exactly did you learn coming up, and then what did you apply from that being in the trenches to being state's attorney about your approach to prosecution?
I just started to sort of look around, and I began to realize that the criminal justice system is not a monolith. And in fact, it's the most disaggregated form of government that we have. And it's interesting because I'm Catholic, and so the rules of subsidiarity are important to me. And so the most important thing should be the most local thing. And I think the criminal justice system is something that's incredibly local, that is incredibly important, and therefore should be local. And so how we did justice in McHenry County is significantly different from how they did justice in Cook County, is significantly different from how they did justice, especially down south, even to the west of us, which is mostly farmland, et cetera. It's very unique. And so it's sort of its own criminal justice system. And so when people talk about the criminal justice system and the deficits of the criminal justice system or the virtues of the criminal justice system, whatever it is, I always ask, what criminal justice system are you talking about? So I can give you an example. Cook County incarcerates about 550 per every 100,000 residents. We in McHenry County incarcerated about 90 for every 100,000 residents. So that's a huge difference. So when people say, well, we have a mass incarceration problem, I would say, where do we have a mass incarceration problem? Because we don't have a mass incarceration problem in McHenry County. In fact, our incarceration rates are on par with more moderate European countries that you would hold out as the examples of how we should be incarcerating people. And then I also realized that almost everything that they said about police was wrong and a lie. I realized that law enforcement have to deal with the saddest, most infuriating, most aggravating form of humanity possible. And they handle it for the most part with a significant amount of restraint and charitability and generosity. When you talk about law enforcement in the vile terms that many people in Illinois did, especially to further political ends, not only were you lying, you were demoralizing an entire group of incredibly good, thoughtful people who were trying to do something for the community and putting their ass on the line in a way that you never would because you're a gutless coward. And so all of that sort of coalesced in my mind. And then I began thinking to myself, like, well, if they're lying about that, what else are they lying about? And there was just a political awakening that kind of hit me early in my 30s. And now I'm staunchly conservative. And based on my experience in law enforcement, I've come to realize that the worst thing that you can do for anybody, myself included, is to not hold me strictly accountable for my actions, that you are not doing people a favor by minimizing the response to their actions. You're not doing them a favor.
What programs did you institute and how did you learn about what it means for accountability? Because oftentimes we institute the veterans docket or the mental health docket or the drug court, and there's no teeth to any of these things. It's like patting addicts on the head and saying, be better, or here's a card to the outpatient center. I hope you get clean. So, what did you guys do in McHenry County that was different or what other jurisdictions weren't doing?
So I immediately recognize that addiction or substance abuse or whatever you want to call it is not a disease. It is not a disease. I will not call it a disease. It's not a disease. Stop calling it a disease. It's a choice. It's a constrained choice. It's a very difficult choice, but at the end of the day, it's ultimately a choice. So there were people during the opioid epidemic, starting in 2016, who wanted to say things like, a person who's dealing drugs, that's just part and parcel or a quote unquote symptom of what their disease is. And as a result of that, because of that, they can't be held accountable. So they would try to analogize drug use to the flu or to cancer or to whatever it is. And criminal behavior was just sort of a symptom of that disease. And I said to myself, and I said publicly, even if that's true, like let's say that it's true that using drugs or this compulsive need to inject yourself or to ingest whatever your substance of choice may be, let's say that that ultimately is out of your control. That doesn't necessarily mean that the only way in which to get money is to sell poison to other people. And if you've been in the opioid or fentanyl game longer than banker's hours, you're going to know somebody who's died or passed away. So if your solution to your quote unquote disease is that you need to sell drugs that ultimately are putting at risk the lives of other young people and constituents in McHenry County, that's a very cruel, selfish act that is worthy not only of my contempt, but it's also worthy of a response by the criminal justice system. And so what we did is instead of saying like, oh, like you just need to get treatment, which the dirty little secret of the criminal justice system is that nobody is that treatment probably doesn't work and nobody has any proof that it works. And so if your solution is that for me that I'm supposed to put somebody who is a clear and present lethal threat to other people in the community into a program that has you cannot convince me or show me statistics actually is going to work or cause that person not to continue to have a disease that's going to be a fatal and lethal threat to other people in the community, then that person's going to prison. And so we started enforcing what's called the drug induced homicide laws, which is if you sell a drug to somebody and you're part of that chain of distribution and that drug ultimately kills somebody, you can be charged with drug induced homicide, which has mandatory DOC sentences and other enhanced penalties. And we began doing that in McHenry County. And if you juxtapose what we were doing in McHenry County versus Lake County, which is the county directly to our east, which is a really big county just north of Chicago, as well as some of these other counties, we saw our overdose deaths be cut in half. And the reason that our overdose deaths were cut in half is because the dealers stayed out of McHenry County because they knew that we enforced those laws, and they knew that we would come pick them up no matter where they were, even if they said, "Where the hell's McHenry County?" Because somebody went into the city and just sort of and they'd say, "Well, wait, you're taking me where? I've never been to McHenry County. I didn't do anything. You guys are setting me up." No, no, no. You distributed a drug to somebody who ultimately died in McHenry County. Anyway, it became very well known in and around McHenry County just to stay out of McHenry County if you're going to do those drugs. Because of that, our opioid overdose death was cut in half as soon as we started that. Whereas all of the other contiguous counties, their overdose deaths continued to rise. And everybody would say, like, "Oh, Kenneally, you're so cruel. You lack compassion for people who are under the sway of these horrible drugs that they had no choice in doing because they had knee surgery and they got addicted to opioids," which doesn't happen. Okay. And I just would say, my response was like, I'm not the one who's being cruel. I can draw a straight line between this policy and holding people accountable and lives in McHenry County not being lost, people not being deprived forever of their loved one. That person forever is dead in the ground, can't bring them back. And so don't call me cruel. I'm the one that's trying to mitigate and to ensure that people don't suffer the ultimate loss, which is to lose a loved one.
It's one of those things where we often think of, in the case of murders or even in the case of sexual assaults or all these other things, victims live with their and the families of victims in the case of deaths live with the consequences of other people's actions for the rest of their lives. It like you've taken away a human life, and the idea that they don't deserve consequences is ridiculous. And moving from one drug, mostly opioids and other hard drugs, to what people called soft drugs, you were saying there's a sensibility out there where we can downplay the consequences or the accountability because it's an addiction or it's this or it's that, or these people are somehow the victims of the system, not the perpetrators. One of the things is for years we've been told that marijuana is safer, healthier, is good for you. It's the Flintstone vitamins of drugs. And I just wanted to read to you because there's nothing funnier than you or I finding the New York Times in agreement. The New York Times wrote back in February in an editorial after a series of articles came out laying out the details, which rarely will I tell you, go read the New York Times. But go read the New York Times, Google New York Times marijuana in the last 6 months. Brilliant stuff. Where have they been before that? And the editorial board wrote at the time, talking about when they were endorsing the complete legalization in Wild Wild West of marijuana, supporters of legalization predicted that it would bring few downsides. And by supporters, they mean them. That's a direct indirection where they are telling you it was other people who said these crazy things. In our editorials, we describe marijuana addiction and dependence as a relatively minor problem. And many advocates went further and claimed that the marijuana was a harmless drug that might even bring net health benefits. It's the celery of drugs. And they also said that legalization might not lead to greater use. At least one, and then it goes on and says, one, now we have 18 million daily users, which by the way is 5% of the US population is smoking weed or something every day is what the statistics show, which means it's way higher. And then two, at least 1 in 10 people who use marijuana develops an addiction as a similar share as alcohol. And then it goes into greater detail about cannabis use disorder vis-a-vis psychotic breaks. And we're getting all this information now that it's causing this. So one of the other places where you sort of were mugged by reality, not that you were ever pro pot, but that you seemed indifferent to it, and you've become a crusader. And now the New York Times is endorsing your point of view. Tell us about marijuana in a greater policy scope and what happened over the last 20 years and where we stand now.
So, like, I know I don't. I know that if you saw me at like a concert or something, you'd be like, "That guy's a total narc with his glasses and baldness." But I used to be kind of cool, and me and my buddies smoked a lot of marijuana during my high school days and early college days. And one of the things that you sort of don't realize when you're a kid is just everything that you're getting away with. And then you realize later in life that you haven't gotten away with anything. So I look back at some of the problems that I had, and I look back at a lot of the mental health problems that some of my friends had. And I begin to see the picture sort of becomes into relief where cannabis was at the root of a lot of the friction and problems and ultimately mental health disorders that were going on all around me that, of course, you don't see. So I came into when I was running in 2016 for state's attorney, there were a lot of Republicans. And one of the things that you have to understand is that when you're talking about like local Republican events, a lot of times there's some people that look like they came out of the movie The Hills Have Eyes who come up to you and just want to like yell at you and have these arguments about you. And you sort of sometimes you think they're reactionary or regressive. But people kept coming up to me and expressing concerns with regard to cannabis. And they'd say things like, Illinois is getting ready to legalize cannabis. What are you going to do about it, Kenneally? And my response every single time was, I'm not going to do anything about it because we have people dropping like flies with the opioid epidemic. We had some of the highest statistics in the state of Illinois with respect to fatalities when I was running for state's attorney. And I'd say like that's really going to be my focus, but it just didn't end. And so just sort of being the pugnacious Irishman that I am, I thought to myself, like, I'm going to research this stuff and just so when people come up to me, I can say like, oh, well, did you know the NIH said this or the CDC said that? And it turns out that cannabis is essentially harmless and the worst case scenario makes you laugh and want to eat pork rinds or whatever. Um, but again, it's like the person who starts in Genesis, and by the time they get to Revelation, they're full on fire Christians. By the time I started my cannabis research to the time that I ended it, I was on fire with the message that cannabis was wrong and bad, and that it is a significant contributor to a number of mental health diseases, not least of which is scary stuff like schizophrenia, psychosis, bipolar, with psychotic symptoms, depression, anxiety. It has no known medical treatments, at least the cannabis that they sell in the store. I mean, there's some isolates of cannabinoids, which is not delta 9 THC, which can be used to treat epilepsy in kids or whatever, but that's dosed and that's put in a medication. So the stuff that you're buying at a store is not medicine. It hasn't been approved by the FDA to treat anything. And the reason that it hasn't been approved by the FDA to treat anything is because it's not medicine. And all of the people who will come up to you and they'll swear that they can't sleep without it or that it helps with their fibromyalgia or their pain or their arthritis or whatever, to me, they're the biggest victims of the cannabis industry themselves. And the vast majority of them probably have what's called cannabis use disorder. And they talk about cannabis the same way that my grandfather or some of my uncles or many people in my family used to talk about alcohol, which is like, I just need it, every single day. It just helps me. It puts a little color into my life. It takes the edge off, whatever the case may be. And that's how they're talking about it. And they don't realize that a lot of the language that they're using sounds like addiction, but because they've been convinced by the cannabis industry that this is medicinal, that's then what they think it is.
That's exactly where we got to the opioid use disorder. We
Exactly
always
right.
had a heroin problem, but what people did was their gateway was prescription opioids. And we were told by the big pharma or whatever, that opioids weren't addictive. They literally told you Vicodin when it came out in the late 90s wasn't harmful. It was like Tylenol. And then it comes out, obviously, we have all these problems with people getting pill popping. And then once we start cutting down on the pill mills, people have to go to the streets to buy the drugs, Percocet or Oxycontin, and then eventually that. And we basically doing the same thing here is that we basically told people it wasn't harmful. We were wrong. I'm sorry, 18 million of you were addicted and use it every day.
That's exactly right. The reason why that we are in the midst of a cannabis epidemic right now, and the reason why nobody recognizes it is because unlike the opioid epidemic, the bodies in the coroner's office aren't piling up. But there is an ongoing epidemic of mental health that we are currently suffering from that is directly related to the increase in cannabis use at higher potencies than we've ever seen before. So I realized that this was going to be a problem and I began to sound the alarm on it. And so I'll just tell you a little story about Illinois, just so for those of you who are listening and who are not from Illinois, this pretty much sums it up. So Pritzker runs in 2018 and he says he's going to legalize cannabis. So that's sort of priority one. So they go to what's called the Marijuana Policy Project. The Marijuana Policy Project is an industry group in Washington, D.C., and they say, hey, write the legislation for us. And a guy named Chris Lindsay of the Marijuana Policy Project works with Kelly Cassidy, who was the rep in the House, as well as Toy Hutchinson, who was the rep in the Senate, to begin writing the legislation. So you the cannabis industry that's writing the cannabis legislation. Who do you think is the head of the marijuana policy project in Washington, D.C.? Joby Pritzker, J.B. Pritzker's wife. Okay, so they write the they write up the policy. They push it through one of these like late night sessions where they dump 500 pages of bill onto all the legislatures, and they go to the Democrats like sign it or else you're out in the next session. And after they pass the cannabis bill, Toy Hutchinson, who's a senator from Illinois, she gets a new job. What do you think it is? Well, I'll tell you. She gets a new job as the head of the marijuana policy project in D.C. And Kelly Cassidy's wife gets a job as the vice president of a major cannabis company out of Florida that also operates in the state of Illinois. So, like, if you ever wanted to know how Illinois works, that's ultimately how Illinois works. After legislation, okay, I looked at the suicides in McHenry County. They had doubled, and the number one drug found in the toxicology of the decedents, as you can probably guess, was cannabis. When I saw that, Sean, I was like, pick me up off the floor, gobsmacked, mouth hits like I could not believe that cannabis, as opposed to alcohol, would have been the most common drug found in the decedents until you realize that there's a whole spate of literature that also draws cannabis use to suicidal ideation as well as suicide completion. So now we have suicides in McHenry County, which have doubled because of cannabis. And then in addition to that, there's also violence. So there were multiple murder cases where the defense was not guilty by reason of insanity. And when you dug into these cases, the main drug of choice that a lot of times was fingered as the cause of the insanity was cannabis. There was one case where a guy from Chicago had been smoking cannabis all night. He comes up to McHenry County. He's high. He wants to clear his head driving on some of the country roads in the northwest side of our county. He's listening to Howard Stern, and David Spade, who is a guest of Howard Stern, apparently tells him through the radio to crash into oncoming traffic at 80 miles an hour, which he summarily does, killing the driver, who's a father of two, and putting the other passenger in a nursing home now for the rest of his life with serious brain trauma as well as a broken body. And so you also began to see those things. And now there's a spate of cannabis and violence. And it's also something that once you see it and once you understand what's going on, you'll start seeing it everywhere. One example that I'll give is the Minneapolis shooter who shot up the Catholic school in Minneapolis. Where did he work? He worked at Rise Dispensary. What did he blame his brain deterioration on? Cannabis use.
On the other side of the criminal justice system is people often talk about like somebody with a dime bag or some, a joint going to jail or whatever. If you look at state incarceration by most serious charge or federal incarceration by that matter, the number of people for marijuana possession, even though the thresholds have gone through the roof as to how much possession constitutes, is a tiny fraction. In the federal system, there were two people a few years ago under possession, and every federal prosecutor I've talked about is that was probably a trafficker who pled down to possession in a plea deal and was doing a year for that possession. But in fact, these are trafficking offenses, they're mules, they're whatever. They're moving freight for the cartels. And if you haven't seen what has gone on, and you're talking about the traffic accident, the state of Washington and the state of Colorado were two of the first states to create a medical and then a legalized marijuana regime. Their own departments of transportation did studies and found the number of marijuana-induced DUIs skyrocketed, and fatal DUIs were even higher than alcohol. Like the numbers, both the raw and percentage numbers, the odds somebody who was committing a DUI and committing a crash that killed someone because they were on marijuana were going through the roof. And then they took it a step further in Colorado, and they analyzed where the marijuana was coming from, and they found out that the highly regulated dispensary system was too expensive for the potheads. So the Cuban mafia, seriously, there's a Cuban mafia, came in and was undercutting the dispensaries in like fly by night things. And then when the cops came in, they just asserted that they were legal under the Colorado law, even though they didn't have the license and whatever. And the cops are like, this is too big of a hassle. Like, I'm not going to deal with this. Just, we could steal your inventory or take your cash, but like going to court So we're just not going to. We're just going to tell you to go home and we'll close down the place for the day. And then they pop up somewhere else. So they brought in organized crime to run a legal enterprise. It was crazy. Nobody wants to go into like the crime associated with marijuana trafficking.
Hey, you know what? I can riff off the I got 3 points off of that. One is you're absolutely right. So one of the ways that they sold marijuana to Illinoisans is they said that, "Hey, like, there's so many people who are being incarcerated for non-violent drug offenses, especially marijuana." But if you actually looked at the statistics from the IDOC, which they had, which I pointed out every single chance I could get, 0.3% of the people were there for a marijuana-related offense. Okay. And I can promise you that none of those people were there for a personal possession offense where they had a dime bag and which they were using to help with their glaucoma. No, none of them were there. They were heavy traffickers of hundreds, if not thousands, of pounds of cannabis. And just like you said, a lot of the cases may get pled down to a class 3 or a class 4 when it was charged as a class X just to move the case along, but 0.3%. So it wasn't exactly a drain on the system. Now, with respect to cannabis, one of the dirty little secrets of law enforcement is that uh, police do not stop crimes. Like, they don't stop crimes. They respond to crimes, but for the most part, they do not stop crimes. The people that stop crimes and the best law enforcement agencies are people in and around the community. So that when you see something that's going on outside of your room, you're going to call the police. When you say something to the effect that cannabis is now legal, even though people don't necessarily understand that that doesn't mean all cannabis, it just means personal possession, but you're making a broad social as well as a broad cultural statement that this kind of stuff is okay. That's exactly the type of environment that drug traffickers want to operate in, because when somebody is looking out their window and they see 5 people loading 10 marijuana plants into the back of a pickup truck, they're far less likely to call the police than they otherwise would be. And what they find is that, especially in Illinois, when you're going to tax marijuana up to 33% of what its value is, you're just creating a black market, because what is the competitive advantage for the black market? It's the price. And the person who's buying has no risk anymore because they can personally possess a certain amount of cannabis. So buying from the black market presents no risk to them whatsoever, which is another attribute with regard to cannabis. Now, you also brought up driving. So not only does cannabis increase the carnage on the roadway, it also makes it harder to prosecute. And that's because cannabis and THC, delta 9 THC, which is what gets into your blood, is what's called hydrophobic, which means that it hates water and wants to get to the fattiest part of your body as fast as it can, which generally is your brain. So if you compare it to alcohol, there's a good relationship between the amount of alcohol that you have in your blood, because alcohol loves water and stays in your blood, and your impairment. There's no such relationship with cannabis. All right. 90% of cannabis is out of your system within a half hour, and then the vast majority of it is out soon after that. So pulling somebody's blood and saying, like, aha, there's this amount of tetragrams of cannabis in your blood, that doesn't mean anything with respect to impairment. So if I leave this podcast and I get into my car after taking a couple bong rips and I run a stop sign and hit a family of 4, if I was drunk, they'd take me to the hospital because I have some injuries. They'd pull my blood. It's a headshot. I'd be a 0.23. It's easy to prosecute. If I'm high on cannabis and they pull my blood, now they don't know what my level of impairment is. And if I'm in the hospital because I have my own injuries and they're not able to interact with me and say bloodshot, glassy eyes and strong smell of cannabis and slurred speech and whatever else it is that they want to say are the, you know, sort of trappings of me being under the influence of cannabis, they can't prosecute it.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things where they've had a series of unintended consequences that they didn't anticipate, or did maybe they did anticipate and didn't care. But speaking of unintended consequences, Illinois is famous, and it joins the pantheon of New York and so many other states where you reformed bail, and they call it appropriately the Safety Act. Other people call it the Pretrial Fairness Act. Can you explain to our listeners what the Safety Act is and why Patrick Kenneally is its biggest enemy?
So, like, in order to understand how galling the Safety Act is, you sort of have to get a sense of how it was passed. And I know I'm telling a bunch of stories here, but I'm Irish, and that's what our kind does. So, the Safety Act was in 2019, which was the year before the Safety Act. there was somebody from the Black Caucus in Illinois. Now, there's such a thing as the Black Caucus. It's unbelievable that it actually exists, that we're organizing political interests around race in Illinois, and that's somehow acceptable. But anyway, there's this thing called the Black Caucus in Illinois where the Black legislators get together and they push certain legislative items that are a priority for them. And one of them was bail reform and the elimination of cash bail. In 2019, they tried to get that, they filed that bill. Madigan, who was the Speaker of the House, Michael Madigan, if you're not from Illinois, he was a formidable Speaker of the House who had been in power for almost 30 years. He controlled what was called the Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee, every piece of legislation had to go through the Rules Committee in order to be passed. If he didn't want it to leave the Rules Committee, it would never leave the Rules Committee. He never let he never let this legislation leave the Rules Committee because he knew that it was incredibly politically unpopular and that it could jeopardize the Democratic majority in the state of Illinois. So the year before the Safety Act was passed, they tried to get it out of the Rules Committee. Madigan put the kibosh on it because it was just a dead letter. In 2020, Madigan is under investigation by the feds for fraud with respect to ComEd, which is the utility here in Illinois. And he's got a problem because he's been in power now for decades. There's a lot of people who are gunning for him, and he needs 60 votes to maintain his House majority ship. So there were enough Democrats after the article came out about him being under investigation for the FBI who said, look, despite the fact that Mike Madigan has sort of been this towering figure in Illinois politics, very formidable, very scary, and will enact retribution against all of his enemies, I'm not going to back Mike Madigan for the House, which denied him the 60 votes to get it. So Mike Madigan needed to scramble and buy time. And so he goes to the Black Caucus, which was about 20 members in the House, and he says, listen, you guys are 20 votes. You guys cannot agree to back anybody else in the House for Speaker until I can sort of get through this political problem and I can then get the 60 votes. So he used the Black Caucus as a block to keep anybody else from getting the votes to be the next House Speaker. And in exchange for that, he agreed to let this legislation out of the Rules Committee, but not just let it out of the Rules Committee, let it out at lame duck session. Now, the lame duck session is a session that occurs in the Illinois legislature at the end of December, right before the new legislature takes their seats at the very beginning of January. So all of the legislators who are quote unquote lame ducks because because at the start of the year, they're going to be essentially out of a job, they can go and vote any way that they want. Now, 2020, there was the whole cultural upheaval with respect to George Floyd, and police were persona non grata, and everybody was talking about the criminal justice system this, the criminal justice system that, and that had been seeded for about a decade before that. And they ultimately used the George Floyd thing as a brilliant piece of propaganda, really, to sort of drive their political agenda. But anyway, it seemed that it was having their cultural moment. So we in law enforcement get word at the end of December that like, hey, they're thinking about passing this law. And everybody's like, no, they're not really honestly going to go to end cash bail, especially like we need committee hearings and we need to have debate. And like, they should engage in some sort of democratic process to determine whether or not the terms of this bill is actually a good idea. But of course, that was our naivete talking. So they drop a 700-page bill that is half written, nobody had read, and they do it in the early morning hours of the night on one of the final days of the 3-day legislative session. Everybody votes on it and then heads over to the Senate, and the Senate votes on it as well. And they had one sort of small committee hearing right at the start of lame duck session. And so us as prosecutors, we have our own sort of organization. Police have their own organization. And they had a bunch of speakers. And the first set of speakers was the public defender's office. And then there were all these quote unquote advocates from these organizations whose constituency was essentially representing criminal defendants, like the Uptown Legal Center and the
Are you talking about the pro-criminal lobby? It's a very strong
exactly
lobby these
like
days.
firmly the
I don't know where criminals get all their money. I mean, maybe it's just the ill-gotten gains, but somebody's funding these criminal lobbies.
so it was the
You know
bail
where the
reform
cannabis lobby
project.
gets its money.
Yeah. So they were
You
all
don't
part
know
of
where
this
the criminals
umbrella.
get all theirs.
It was part of this umbrella organization and trying to figure out where all this money was coming from. Nobody knew. But anyway, the point is that the biggest stakeholders here had almost no say, and what they had to say was almost an afterthought at the end of this committee meeting, where we got sort of 5 minutes to make our case after this whole parade of activists got to have their say. And it was kind of funny because they would make mention of the fact that they were still writing that provision for this particular senator. So it was these people who ultimately were writing the bill. And it's just so mind-numbingly stupid, because you're thinking to yourself, like, how is it that the Illinois legislature has been hijacked, where we're passing sweeping legislation with the singular thought that we're going to benefit criminal defendants? Like, how did we get to that point where that's not a consideration as part of what sweeping criminal legislation is? Of course, fairness and due process and all the rest of that. But the singular purpose, the thing that we're trying to do, is to act on behalf of people who don't give a damn about the constitutional rights of other people, don't give a damn about the property rights of other people. And anyway, that's where it was. Now, it turns out, as part of that too, they passed a package with regard to police reform and body cameras. And again, this is Illinois for you, but the Senate sponsor of the Safety Act was a lawyer. And who did he represent? He represented a police body camera company called Axon, which it makes up a huge share of the market. I'm sure you've probably heard of it, Sean. Makes up a huge share of the market. And so you have these conflict of interest, and then just the way that they did it was so unscrupulous, where they're dropping hundreds of pages of legislation that's nobody's read and then passing it in the middle of the night, despite the fact that this is going to make categorical changes to how the criminal justice system is done and get rid of cash bail, which has been in place for hundreds of years.
And so give us a rundown on what has happened since this elimination of cash bail statewide, and what don't we know yet?
One of the things that they say is, well, look at all of our social scientific research and this gray literature that's put out by the ACLU about how there's no difference between people who either are denied bail or are on cash bail or otherwise, and their criminal conduct. And my point is you're missing the point. Like, if one person who is charged and we have probable cause to believe that they committed a violent offense and has a criminal history which is long as my arm, gets out on bail and commits an atrocious crime, it's not worth it. It's not worth it. So ultimately what the Safety Act did is it created the presumption that you are subject to bail on your own recognizance, which means no money and no conditions whatsoever. And so you have this strong presumption that the prosecution has to overcome with clear and convincing evidence the day after the crime is committed. So if we want to hold you, we have to present clear and convincing evidence that you are either a risk to somebody else in the community or that you are a willful flight risk. A lot of times it's just not enough time in order to do that. But what the Safety Act did too is it divided all crimes into two different categories. There's category A offenses, where the state's attorney's office can present evidence to hold somebody. And then there's category B offenses, where it doesn't matter what the person's criminal justice system is. It doesn't matter what they've done, what they said, how much a judge is convinced that that person will be a danger while they're out on bond, that the judge has to release them. And I will concede that those are less serious offenses, but they are the majority of the offenses. One of the major problems is that they're the drug offenses. So if I get busted for distribution of fentanyl, okay, and I show up in bond court the next day and I go to the judge and I'm like, you know what, judge? I love selling drugs and I love using drugs and I'm not going to stop. And if you let me go, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to buy more fentanyl. I'll probably distribute some of it and I'll also use it. And I know that my criminal history shows violent offenses and multiple stints in rehab and multiple opportunities and multiple prior drug offenses. The judge has no choice. They have to release that person because it's part of what's called a category B offense. Like, that's the major problem. And the last thing that I'll say is, when it comes to cash bail, everybody's like, oh, well, it's poor people that are no. What cash bail would allow a judge to set bail in an amount that they thought a person could pay. If they wanted to hold a person, they'd set bail in an amount that they knew the person couldn't pay. If they didn't want to hold a person, they'd set bail at an amount that the person could pay. Most crimes have some victim or somebody who is out money because of the fact that the crime was committed, whether it's for injuries, whether it's for property, whether it's for whatever. And if you don't have cash, you starve the system. So who's going to pay for the criminal justice system, and then who's going to pay restitution at the end of it? And if you think that somebody who doesn't have money already in the bank it's going to pay, you're wrong.
So again, I want to thank Patrick for joining us. Please come back on the show at your soonest convenience when you can catch a flight in from the Windy City. So thanks again, Patrick.
Sean, you're a good friend. I really appreciate this.
Thank you for listening. Tune in to the next episode and follow us on Substack and download our episodes on any podcast platform you use. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next episode.